February 14th, Valentine Day program of the Planning Policy Commission. Before we start, I want to make a couple comments. I wasn't here last week, and I know that the mayor came and said some really nice words. And I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to thank her, because I think we really appreciate having her come in and understanding that we do spend a lot of time going over this and try our best to help the city on their road of I don't know. And I want to send a congratulations out to our former member,
Lindsay,
who is now a member of the city council. So I'm really pleased that she is on the city council. She did a great job on here, and I'm sure she will on the city council. And the last thing is, AJ is not with us anymore because he is now on the Transportation Committee. And he did love us, but his passion is transportation, so I hope he does well and is happy in his new surroundings. So with that, I need a motion for approval of the minutes for January 24th.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes of January 24th, 2019.
Have a second?
Like to second?
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Since Keith is standing at the podium, I assume that we're going to get an update before we continue with the public comments, public hearing.
Sure. Just a brief one. Thank you, Madam Chair. Keith Niven, Director of Economic Development and Development Services for the city. So in your packet tonight, we put a number of things. One of the things was basically a memorandum, and I assume at some point we'll probably be spending most of our time here. And what I did was to provide the comments that we got we got comment letters, if you remember the day of the hearing last time. And so what I did was I just basically clipped all those comments in under the provider. So there's a section for Verizon, a section for T-Mobile, and a section for AT&T. And then a column for how the city responded to that comment, and then if there was proposed code change, what that would look like. So I assume probably most of what we'll do tonight is go through this and probably land on those things where the city didn't agree with the comments that were provided by the provider and talk through those and see if you guys have any questions for why we didn't agree with the proposed changes that came in through public comment. And then I assume, and we can do that either before the continuation of the hearing, or we can hear if there's any other comments and then go through the memo. It's your choice.
What would you like to do? I'd kind of like to get your comments first.
Okay. So I'm going to go through this painstakingly line by line, since apparently nobody wanted to do anything else on Valentine's Day than be here. So for the next 3 hours, we'll be going through this memo. I'm just kidding. It won't be that long.
We'll have questions.
It will be that long. Won't be that long. All right. So starting with, excuse me, starting with Verizon, and for no reason other than, I think we got their letter first. So first item, number one, they had a comment about clarifying the shot clocks. We agreed with that comment. And so we provided some additional language into the proposed code amendment to address it. The second one, 1822-090-B3 in Table C, could be read to prohibit small wireless facilities in the right-of-way from single-family residential zones. So we did modify the language to show that property used as single-family residential cannot be used for small cell. But also the city zoning map, and we used to have one in this room.
yeah, they took it down.
So if you look at the city zoning map's a very beautiful map with a bunch of colors on it. The colors are reflective of the different zones in the city. And what you see when you look at that map is all the public right-of-ways are white. So they actually don't carry a particular zone with them. So the concern that by us either discouraging or prohibiting in a single-family zone would affect the right-of-way, it does not, because the right-of-way does not carry the zone as the adjacent property, unless it's a private street. Now, a private street is not public right-of-way. And so the language, so we did some edits to allow for public or for private streets in residential areas to basically not count in terms of the prohibition. So that if there was a private street, let's assume you had a cul-de-sac and it wasn't a public street, it was a private street, and a provider needed to put an antenna on a light pole in the private street, they could do that, right? Rolling down to, see how fast this is going? Number 3, 18, 22, 090, and 100. Add a subsection in each to allow for relief from standards if the denial would amount to a prohibition. And what we did is we added a section in 90, which is citing criteria. So we created a deviation section in the citing criteria, which basically, remember the way we drafted our code, there was an encouraged area, there was a discouraged area, and there was a prohibited area, right? Like new poles on Front Street. We said we didn't want those, so we prohibited them. If a provider needs to put an antenna on Front Street on a pole, that's the only way they can make their system work, and they provide us with the information that supports that, the deviation section would say they could go ahead and do that, okay? Section 100 is the design section, all right? And what the ask was is that we should also allow for deviations in design. And my sense is, no, I don't think so. If we ask you to color it brown, paint it brown, I don't think there's a reason why that would prohibit you from putting that antenna there because it's brown, right? I mean, if, you know, so I couldn't come up with, and Daniel Kenny from Ogden Murphy Wallace and I talked through that one. I don't think we could find a design situation that would lead to a prohibition, and so we did not add the deviation section to the design piece. We left it in just citing. Number 4, 1822, 100, 2B limits the height of a new pole to 30 feet, which is inconsistent with the FCC definition of small wireless. The red line changed to limit to 50 feet. Okay, so our response was the city has an interest in keeping excessively tall poles out of the community where possible, and we talked about that extensively when we adopted the code in the first place. So we revised to start with 30-foot poles and allow higher when necessary with a maximum of 50. So we did add the language to be what we thought consistent with the FCC order. So they could ultimately do a 50-foot pole, but the code says we really want it at 30. And if you have to go higher than 30, you're going to have to help us understand why it needs to be higher than 30. All right? 1822 100 2D requires a form factor for small wireless facility only poles that would be unworkable for Verizon's small wireless design and is incompatible with 5G, which requires exterior panel antennas. The FCC order requires that aesthetic requirements for small wireless facilities be no more burdensome than those for similar infrastructure in the right-of-way, etc. So our response was Verizon participated in the input process when the code was additionally drafted. So if you remember, and I can flip to that really quickly. So you remember we talked about, you know, the wonky thing about Issaquah. Well, we have a lot of wonky things. We're going to talk about treasures later tonight. But one of the things that's a little funky about our community is we have a lot of different poles. You know, we have kind of rust-colored poles on Front Street that are oldie fashioned. We have green poles up in the Highlands. We have black poles in Tallis that are kind of like a mariner theme. We've got shoe boxes on Gilman that are black. So we have all these different kind of poles, right? And so we debated, how do we write code language which would allow the city to ask the providers to put a pole that would be complementary to the location where they were going to put it, right? And so we put a generic pole, getting there, sorry. Super cool though, so it's worth the wait. Look at that. So we said, hey, here's an example of a pole that you can put in. So there is predictability. They can put that pole in if they wanted to. Or it says, if you read up above it in subsection D, or as approved by the designated official, right? So let's assume that Verizon says that pole doesn't work for us. Our pole looks different. I'm not going to show you that unless you need to see it. Then what we would do would be we'd work through that with them. You know, it gives us the ability to work more on an application by application basis to get a pole that works for them without trying to somehow populate our code with all the different options of poles that we have in our city. This just seemed like a better approach, and that hasn't changed. So you know, part of what we tried to limit ourselves to was let's suggest edits to the code based on the FCC order. This pole issue that Verizon's bringing up in this particular item really isn't different than it was when we adopted the initial code. So our response was, it was good enough the first time, it's going to be good enough now. So
Keith,
yes, ma'am.
aren't there requirements that are imposed on utility poles and the rest of this?
Yes. And you weren't here last time.
No, I wasn't.
So you're catching up. Sorry, Joan.
I watched it, though.
Okay, so think about it in an abstract way. We went through this less than a year ago, and we came up with the code that we thought was the appropriate code for our community. And it's a box about this size. What the FCC said is you gotta make the box bigger, okay? And so what the edits are that are in the current red line of the ordinance respond to the FCC order, and what we tried to do was limit the edits during this round to just those requirements that were coming from the FCC. So there are still requirements, but some of the requirements, like for example, the volume of the equipment went from, I'm going to make up numbers, went from like 17 cubic feet to 28 cubic feet. So the numbers in that particular instance got bigger, and we are changing our code to be compliant with that.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
But there are requirements for each of these other things. I mean, it's not like they can put in whatever they want. I'm just trying to basically understand that sentence because there are requirements.
There are requirements. You want to say something, Daniel? Apparently, my lawyer wants to say something, so I'm going to step aside.
Well, I think what you're getting at is the similarly situated as other utilities that are in the right-of-way. And I think one way to look at that, at least from our perspective, is that this is not a wireline infrastructure deployment, like a cable line or a backhaul line or a power line. Really, there's nothing in the right-of-way that is a facilities such as a 28 cubic foot box on a pole with antennas on top of a pole that would need to be similarly situated to this. They feel like maybe they should be treated the same as a power pole that simply has a line, but this isn't a wireline deployment. So I think when they use that sentence that you read about being similarly situated and being treated the same as other deployments, there really isn't anything to look at, in our view, that is like a small cell deployment.
Way more than I wanted. I just wanted the
Fair.
understanding that, yes, indeed, putting in those types of poles, utility poles, cable ends, that they still had requirements associated with it. So it's not unusual to have, within reason, an FCC approval that these poles would have requirements on it. That's all I wanted. Okay.
Okay. And then last comment from Verizon, 1822-110, 6C, addressing how many cabinets constitute a substantial change for proposed of an eligible facility request is more limiting than the actual language in section 6409A of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, codified under 47 USC section 1455A. The red line inserts the language from the federal act. So we agreed and we revised the language accordingly. Now we're down to T-Mobile. So T-Mobile's first comment, the proposed amendments include a definition of antenna at 1822-040 that is inconsistent with the definition of the same term found in 47 CFR section 1.6002. The proposed Issaquah antenna definition adds volumetric limitations to the federal definition that may be in conflict with the FCC definition of small wireless facility, which is incorporated into the draft amendments. T-Mobile recommends that subsections 1 through 3 of the proposed antenna definition be deleted, and that Issaquah adopt the federal definitions of these terms in order to avoid potential confusion. Our response was, the FCC definition is accurately captured in the first portion of the code definition. We propose removing the additional exemplars, and then we revised it accordingly. So I think that we responded to this comment that was raised by T-Mobile in the edits that we did. Number 2, T-Mobile's small cell design consists of an integrated antenna and equipment unified enclosure that mounts to the exterior of a pole and is painted to match the pole. Okay. Most jurisdictions in Puget Sound region are adopting design standards that expressly allow this type of design. T-Mobile recommends that the definition of a completely concealed facility be amended to add the following sentence at the end of the definition: a small wireless facility providing concealment of antennas and equipment within a single enclosure and otherwise meeting the foregoing provisions of this definition is allowable as a completely concealed facility. Our comment was the proposed changes alter the intent of the definition. T-Mobile does not need this definition change to deploy its design of facilities. And they actually raised this when we adopted the code the first time, and we said no, we thought what we had would allow for their current design to work, so we're not suggesting any revisions to this one. Number 3, IMC 1822-090B includes subsections 1 through 5 that require a provider seeking to install a small cell to examine and justify why 5 different types of structures within a 150-foot radius of the proposed small cell location are not available or feasible before a proposed location can be approved. This is an excessively stringent preferred hierarchy that is applied. So this gets back to kind of our whole concept of they can't look at a discouraged location until they've exhausted all the preferred locations within the area. They didn't like it the first time. They still don't like it. They're trying to make the argument that this is onerous for them. And, you know, if all of their facilities end up in the prohibited column, then yes, this is probably pretty onerous because you have to show that the encouraged locations didn't work, the discouraged locations didn't work, then you had to land in the prohibited locations. And so, I mean, if If they choose preferred locations, they don't have to do any of these studies, right? So it all depends on where they end up wanting to put their facilities. And we felt like with the original code language, there were enough options that most of the carriers should be able to accommodate their deployments in preferred locations. So we did not make any changes. Number 4, the hierarchy site search requirement is of questionable viability under the FCC's may not materially limit or inhibit standard articulated in the September order and in the October regulations. The process of elimination that would be required under this proposed section of the amendment likely will be time-consuming and counterproductive. Same argument. Again, we didn't feel like we needed to make a revision. AT&T's first comment. AT&T has significant concerns with the code's extensive prohibitions and limitations, including prohibitions of small wireless facilities on municipal poles, non-municipal decorative poles, and front street right-of-way, as well as burdensome alternative analyses and design standards. Note on 182209B1 that small wireless facilities cannot feasibly locate with an existing wireless communication facility. Brings up alternatives analysis. Note on table C. Okay, so our response was, with the inclusion of a deviation process, the prohibited column is no longer strictly off limits. So we've addressed the point that we had a prohibited column through a deviation process, and we feel like that meets the requirements of the FCC order. 182209B1, this requirement ensures that if and when small wireless facilities can be located on a pole with another, they do so. Tech is evolving, and it is unclear this will be impossible in perpetuity. So we've heard from all the providers that they can't co-locate with another wireless facility because of interference of signals. What we said is that may be true now, but as technology changes, that may not be true in the future. And our preference would be if you can co-locate antennas on the same structure, that we would prefer that. So we left that language in. Table C, revision to add clarification that single-family residential is exclusive of the public right-of-way. This was the city's intent and is clarified. So again, this gets back to that issue that I mentioned earlier about the fact that public right-of-way does not carry a zone. And so even though we've listed single-family residential as either discouraged or prohibited, the right-of-ways within those neighborhoods would not be. Okay. Comment number 2, the criteria of the deviation section are not consistent with the new legal standards as they are described in the FCC order. Our response, the city has reviewed the design standards and believes no provision amounts to an effective prohibition or would materially inhibit the provision of services. So we made some minor revisions, but we left it pretty much the same. Again, we feel like the design section that we talked about would not prohibit the installation of a new wireless facility. Number 3, language is needed at the end of 182209A3 to recognize that a building or structure mount may not be feasible, regardless of owner agreement, suggests making this section parallel to A1. If the request was granted, but the network provider believes it still cannot locate at the location for other reasons, the network provider must provide the designated official with a detailed explanation of those reasons. We agree with the proposed revision, and we revised it consistent with similar language. Okay. Number 3, deviation section is limited to the code's citing criteria when such relief, that's 090, when such relief is also required when a design standard, and that's the same comment that came in under Verizon, where they wanted the deviation section in both 090 and in 100. And again, we don't believe that there's anything in the design section that would preclude or prohibit a provider from installing a new facility. So the deviation section, so we got a letter from AT&T, today? Maybe it was yesterday, I don't know. It was sometime recently. I don't think I brought it. So they had a suggested edit to the deviation section. So, and I apologize, this is probably not very clear. So our deviation section as added basically says deviations, the city's designated official may approve the siting of a wireless communication facility in a prohibited location only if the following criteria are met, all right? So we initially had under 1, the applicant provides sufficient technical information, and their suggestion was technical or other related information. So there may be some reason other than technical that a prohibited location is the only choice for them. We agreed with that, so we're gonna go ahead and add the or other related information under C1.
What do we believe would fall under or other reason? It's technology. Just curious.
I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's a good question. I
Why
don't
did
know
we
if my-
agree to add it if we don't know what it means?
So right now, this is the exception section of the code, right? So if something were to be a valid reason, there's no variance process. There's no, so what this is, consider this maybe an escape valve. I actually don't like it. I'll just be candid. I don't like it because it's ambiguous for me, right?
It opens the door for anything, right?
Well, so it has to be relevant, I guess. So, because that's what it says. My legal counsel, and if he wants to speak to it himself, he may. His comment was, if there is a non-technical reason that's valid, the code doesn't. There's no escape clause. There's no way for us to allow it. We can't do an adjustment of standards. We can't deviate. This is the deviation section. So this language would allow anything. You're right. It would allow anything. So
why did we put it in?
I'm gonna.
That one line allows deviations across the entire document.
In the citing section only. So it's just in the citing section.
Where we determine prohibited areas.
Right.
Okay?
Well, so just because they provide it doesn't mean that it would be approved. I mean, it has to be sufficient and it has to be relevant, and then there's also other criteria as well. But if you look at the criteria to move from encouraged to discouraged, it is non-technical information that is being provided to make that move. It is contacting those locations and confirming whether or not they can go there, and then there's the opportunity, and we added some language there to even move beyond that. So what this says here is demonstrating that there are no encouraged or discouraged sites available, and to demonstrate no encouraged is already a submission of non-technical information. So it is embracing, this language here in the deviations is embracing that information, it has already become relevant to the discussion through the code. And if you look, and I can show you, so if you look back at like B1 in the citing criteria, that is going to different locations that's co-locating or existing or replacement poles too, and going to the owner of each existing pole within 150 feet and being denied access to that pole. That is a non-technical reason why an encouraged location wouldn't work. And so that same type of thing, both for encouraged and discouraged, could be relevant to the moving to prohibited.
Can you repeat that one more time? I'm having a hard time processing that.
You want to pull that section up?
Sure.
I've got it. Which section?
If you could go to just above. So the deviation criteria not what's on the screen, but the deviation criteria for C1 says the applicant provides sufficient technical or other relevant information that demonstrates that no encouraged or discouraged sites are available. In order to do that, to show that the encouraged are not available in the deviation assessment, this is what they have to show. Because this is already in the code to move beyond encouraged. And doing that, if you just look at number 2, they're going to owners of existing poles within 150 feet and showing the city that they can't go on those poles. They're not being allowed. That is a non-technical piece of information that the city needs in the deviation discussion to show that the encouraged location of an existing or replacement pole isn't going to work. So if we limited it to just technical information, by its nature, we're eliminating this review. And if you look at so this is the table for small wireless communications facilities, the prohibited. So for example, the non-municipal decorative poles, well, I'm sorry, in the discouraged. So property allowing for residential use. So that's different than the property used as single family. If they go to those locations and say, sure, we'll try to go there, but they're not allowed on those uses, similar to what we just looked at above in B2, that is going to be a non-technical but relevant information where they say we would go in discouraged, we went to all of those locations, and we simply can't get on them. They won't allow us to. So it's not a technical thing where that doesn't work for our systems. It's those people just won't let us. So there should be some ability for Keith and his team to look at more than just technical to understand whether or not we're moving to prohibit.
Right, and so thanks for that. All the examples you gave were access to property or poles that they're not allowed to have, but that's the only reason. Can we put that language in there that says the deviation is that they don't have access to the location or technical reasons? Because by leaving it all other reasons or non-technical, it opens it up. Can we be more specific is what I'm asking on that?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think the relevant is trying to narrow, not knowing what information may be relevant. I don't know if I could write out specific things that are other than technical, not knowing what they're going to claim.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Keith? Keith?
Yes, sir. Hang on for 1 second before you ask your question. So just a procedural issue for Planning Policy Commission. You guys can recommend what you want. Our lawyer will address that if your proposal on the deviation section under C1 is that other relevant information is too broad, and that your suggestion is to tighten it down, he will be able to respond to that when this goes to council, right? So if you feel passionate about that, just put a mental note here, and when we talk about your recommendation at the end of the night, you can recommend something different than what's being proposed for C1. And to make sure we get to the right C1, that would be here. So what we suggested was to agree with the proposed edit from AT&T that would be sufficient technical or other relevant information. So if that's feeling a little bit too far to the left or to the right, you can recommend something different. And at the end of the day, just you heard concern from the city attorney about that. Doesn't stop you from making a recommendation. He would have to then address that with the council, because your recommendation will be part of the conversation we have at council committee next week. Ron, did you still have a question?
Yeah, so this actually is, I think, in line with Bill's call out. If we were to go with that language, do we also include Land and Shores oversight in those decisions?
No.
Okay.
So the council, right now, the permitting process is administrative. Even if it's a level 2, which would be a new pole install. You, making it a council decision to permit new wireless facilities is, you could recommend that. The administration wouldn't support that recommendation because, for one thing, I don't think we could achieve it under the shot clocks that we have to actually be able to respond to. Because if you think about it, council committee meets once a month. That could be a 29-day delay. And I've only got like 90 days to do the whole permit review and potential issuance. So you're welcome to suggest a non-administrative process here. I don't think this warrants a council touch.
What about Development Commission?
So Development Commission, again, that's a level 3. And, you know, back to what I said earlier, we tried to only make edits based on the FCC order because we thought the rest of the code was right. Now, the FCC order makes the box a little bigger. If now you believe it needs to go to Development Commission to install a new structure, right now we have that as an administrative decision with public notice, which is probably still more onerous than most of our peer jurisdictions. We have a little bit of a same issue with Development Commission in that it's going to add at least 2 weeks to the process. And I'm already concerned about time. So I don't know, again, I don't know what you're trying to address, Ron, with your suggestions.
These are the outlier situations where we need to actually have a non-technical reason for putting in a cell tower or a small cell site, instead of just leaving it up to city staff, but bringing it into a public discussion using either Land and Shore or the Development Commission as subject matter experts to debate whether or not this is in the community's best interest.
So, all right, so let's assume that the rationale that a provider gives is that they couldn't afford any of the properties within 150 feet. In other words, let's assume that there's 4 property owners around where they need to put a new facility. And let's assume that each of those property owners said, if you're going to put a pole here, I want $10,000. Okay? They could say that that's cost prohibitive, and therefore they need to be in a different place, which might be prohibited by our code. What's the Development Commission going to do with that conversation? And why would you want to push it there? So at the end of the day, there's a process. You know, if the commission is concerned about the expanse of this language, definitely put that in the record. And if you want to suggest something else, you can. I'm not sure the right outcome is send it to a public conversation, personally.
I was thinking about checks and balances, right? So if we send it to city staff, and I know that city staff will do their best, but bringing it to a public forum for discussion, if in fact we have property owners that say they want X number of dollars and the utility company says it's cost prohibitive, we want to put it in this location, and this location happens to be a very sensitive or visually sensitive area and people don't want it there, then it would be in the public's best interest to have that conversation and debate whether or not we want to have that facility there, and in which case, if we choose not to, then it can't be built there, right? So the bar
has been set that we can't prohibit the deployment of their system, okay?
We're not actually,
So then your opinion, we're not. In
Right.
their opinion, we might be, right?
think
So
might have-
all I'm saying is, that, where that ends is either they agree with us or they appeal the decision, right? And I think that, again, you're welcome to recommend what you'd like. I'm not sure the administration would support those two choices. And that's, I'm just gonna leave it at that.
It seems like what you're looking for is to make it tighter, like Bill was saying, make the actual language tighter around that and not making a cumbersome process where, depending on the application, something comes in, opening up to a public, but actually leaving our code, our language to have things come in a normal review process with the administration. Seems a little tighter. So again, I think the idea is if we address it with that language that you're talking about, Bill, that should kind of ideally take care of it. I get the fear of opening something up to the public. I mean, that could drag on forever. And again, if you're already short on time.
Did I say I was afraid? No, I'm just kidding. All right, so just think about your issue, Ron. Let's not try and solve it at this moment. Let's get through the rest of this because we're home stretch, right? This is the end. And then we can hear public comment, and then if you want to debate that part a little bit further, we can do that during commission deliberation. So the second item, there was concern over the proposed language. It used to say the proposed siting will create the least, and the suggestion was to change it to minimize. I like that way better, actually. So it used to say create the least visual and noise impacts, and right now we've changed it to minimize. You know, I don't want to be debating whether what was proposed is the least, because that may not be, it may be impossible to prove what is the least. I think it's clear here, the expectation is to minimize the visual and noise impact. So the example we gave last time, so that you remember, is let's assume that we're in a single family subdivision and there's a street light out front and it's across the street, and that's where the provider wants to put their facility. Okay, that can be done a couple different ways. One is you put it there and you put the box on the front so that I get to look out my bedroom window at it every day, or you put the box on the backside where maybe it's behind a tree and is kind of a little bit more screened and out of view. So it gives the city the ability to do a little bit of adjustment within a certain location so that it hopefully minimizes the impact to the adjacent property owners, and especially if it's residential is the concern. And then we had something about, we had language in here that said, and is the safest option. Again, I don't want to debate the safest option. You know, it has to be safe. You can't, you know, we have other requirements. For example, our street standards have sight visibility lines that are created so that at driveways or intersections, you can't put a pole up that would block somebody's sight that would potentially cause an accident. Likewise, if somebody wanted to put a macro tower in a park, it's going to have to meet all structural requirements so that it doesn't fall over and kill a bunch of kids. So I think we already have code provision that allows it to be safe. I think this language here just created another weird argument point, and I think cutting it out is a cleaner option. The last suggestion that was made by AT&T was that we delete the third section. And what we had in here was that if you choose or are granted the ability to put it in a prohibited location, that the city wanted the carrier to sign an indemnification and hold harmless on that decision. So if somebody came back and sued later, we would be a little bit more protected. That's something that we do now. For example, if we allow somebody to build a subdivision on a steep slope, for example, there's notice on title that's clear and indemnifies the city for those permits that were issued. So this is not an uncommon thing. We don't think it's an onerous thing. And so our suggestion is to leave C3 in. And then the last one, from, it was AT&T. I'm not sure why I put that one up there, not that. Oh, section 100, oh, this was me. I did this one. Right. So section 100B2A is citing criteria that should properly live within section 90B. So what used to be, and I can go to that, because that might be helpful at this point, 100B2A. So what we used to have, so this section 100 is the design section. And this 2A used to say that new poles not be located in any setback area on private and public property. It's not a design issue, really. It's a siting issue. And so, you know, and part of the carriers wanting the deviation section in 100, when I looked through 100, this was the only thing that really didn't belong in 100. It belongs in 90, so, which is siting. So I moved this. It's still in the code. I just moved it from 100 up to 90, which is, I think, where it should have been in the first place. And I know I said I wasn't going to do any code amendments that weren't related to the FCC order, but that one was a cleanup, so I apologize for that. And that's the end of the comments that we received from the providers. If you have questions or want to have more conversation now, I will stick around. If you would rather open up the public hearing and get some more public comment on what the city has agreed to and not, that might be a good choice, but leave it up to you.
Just ask you a minor question. Once all these guys come in and try to get their permits and put up the wireless boxes, and there is 60 and 90-day window that you have to go into, is the city have enough manpower to be able to meet those requirements?
I don't know. So, so the code, another part of the FCC order, so we had originally said that they could kind of take down parts of the city at once and basically that they could consolidate like 10 new facilities in one application. And one of the things that the FCC order said was they could potentially now come in and do one application for the whole city. And that kind of blows my mind because that would be a really hard permit to review because it could potentially be an awful lot of new poles. So we are going to have to, it's going to be a priority for us to meet the shot clocks that were dictated by the FCC order. But that's just what we're going to have to do. So, you know, I think to answer your question is we'll figure it out. We've gotten no applications. I mean, we adopted this original code, I think it was one of the M months. It was either March or May. We haven't gotten any applications in since then. When we talked about when the providers were providing comment last time, there was some questions about when they saw applications potentially coming in. Nobody had a clear horizon for when that might be. So I don't know the answer because it may be years or they may all come in at once. I don't know.
Do you know if they've already been receiving applications for other jurisdictions? Sammamish, Redmond?
So I know what I can tell you is, and you can, and maybe they'll answer that when they come up. I know that there has been, I believe there has been deployment in Bellevue, because I live in Bellevue, and I'm pretty sure I've seen a bunch of white signs related to deployment. So I'm guessing there has been some in Bellevue, but I don't know to the extent of the deployment so far.
I just think it has to be on your radar, that eventually it's gonna have to do it. You're gonna get a lot, even the permitting process for houses takes a long process and a lot of time, and this might be a huge project, so.
Could be.
So with that, I'm going to continue from January 24th, the public hearing in regard to the siting of wireless communication facilities, and ask if there's anybody that would like to make a public comment. Nobody signed up? Anybody sign up?
It doesn't look like we can have them sign
It
up
doesn't.
after.
Come to the podium.
If you don't have their names, we can have them sign up with them.
Good evening. My name is Greg Bush. I'm with Wireless Policy Group. We're consultants for AT&T. So first, I'm going to be as brief as I possibly can. I grew up doing kid stage. Last thing I want to do is get in the way of Issaquah treasures, so please. All right. So thank the commission for considering our comments a second time, and thanks staff for working to update the code and keep the process going as quickly as it has been. We're really appreciative. So previously, AT&T suggested changes that would bring the code in line with recent FCC order. We understand the city's goal is to provide something that's workable practically and makes sense to staff to allow them to actually interpret the code. So we're on board with that. With that in mind, we do suggest, we agree with staff in that with the language changes for section 1822090C with A and B, with the language with minimizing and safety. AT&T is committed to safety and minimizing impacts on the local community. With regard to the situations with technical information being provided, we support the staff edits mainly because if you limit the information that we can provide to staff to technical information only, that limits it to RF analysis, that limits to if we can physically put a pole there. But the reality of the situation is, when you're drafting something like this, it's impossible to see into the future because the real world, you can come up with a great long list of things that could potentially put a site out of commission, whether it's neighbors or neighbors asking 10 grand or a neighbor saying, maybe if you come back in 3 months, I might have a deal for you. And then the city could say, okay, well, why don't you wait 3 months? That's something like that. Situations that keep changing and moving the goalposts, it's so hard to draft that, and I really feel for council on this one. So practically, there are so many reasons that you don't want to have a specific list of situations, and trusting city staff to just consider it. When you put the situation to technically and other relevant info, that's not opening the floodgates. That's just allowing them to be considered. That doesn't mean you have to consider it. It doesn't mean you have to accept them. It just means you're even allowed to put them on the table in the first place. And these could be valid reasons. One of the criteria is they have to be a relevant reason. So we just ask that the language be put in there so that the reasons can be considered. Otherwise, that's a rejection, and the only available option is for the industry to challenge it. Second, how am I on time? Okay, we're good. We think the indemnification section in 0930C3 is a little odd, because this is a siting decision. AT&T would also like to have the deviations section be put in the design, but here it's just in siting. So the deviations can only apply to where we actually physically put the site. We view this as more of a decision on where the site is and how we're going to build the site. So when you put an indemnification provision, that's related to safety. The example staff gave was houses sliding down hills. This is...
I thought the staff removed that.
For design.
No, we want to keep it in.
Okay, got it, yeah.
This is the indemnification thing. So let me back up a bit. AT&T suggests removing the indemnification thing because this is not a house that could potentially slide down a hill and cause massive amounts of damage. This is an aesthetic decision and a siting location. This is not going to slide down a hill. This is a pole that is still subject to all the rigorous safety requirements that we have elsewhere in this proposed code change. So indemnification seems odd to put here for what is essentially an aesthetic decision. And let's see, I think
Just to be clear, you just want whatever is written in another section. You're not opposed to what it said. He wants to delete it.
I'd like to,
Well, that's
AT&T
what I
recommends
wanted to be
removing the
clear.
indemnification section. It's odd to put it there. This is the section determining where we can put a site and saying, oh, if we put the site in the wrong location, there could be grievous harm. We don't think that. We don't think that a 30-foot tall pole is equivalent to houses sliding down a hill. And let's see, I think that is about it. And if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Question?
Good evening. My name is Devendra Maharaj with Verizon Wireless. First, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. Verizon thanks you for the changes you made to the request previously submitted to the city. Verizon also supports AT&T's request in 1822090C3 regarding the removal of the language. And lastly, Verizon is looking forward to working with the city. Thank you very much.
That was the shortest comment that I've ever, thank you. Would anybody else like to make a comment?
I don't think.
Please do.
That'd be Dave Kapler. I think you probably know him.
David Kapler, 255 Southeast Andrews Street. I've stepped into this one before, but volume. How many cubic feet of stuff can be hung up in the air in somebody's potential view or just along our streets? And I hope that issue is addressed. Before it was 14, 15, now we're 20. 20 cubic feet is almost 30 5-gallon buckets. Okay, how much do you want to put up in the air? Are we dealing with the visual of stuff up high? Of course, if you have it all down by the ground, you got a lot more places for graffiti and stuff. But I'd rather take my chance on the ground than putting a lot of material up in the air. The one tower we saw here looked, very skinny, not much on top. That's one thing, but how much extra stuff you put up at the top is a question.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to make a comment? Would anybody else like to make a comment? Hearing, seeing no other, anybody else willing to do that? I will close the public hearing at 7:29 and ask Keith if there's anything else he'd like to add.
I don't think so. I think we talked about, so the indemnification language that we included in the deviation. Again, I don't see it as being that big of an issue for the providers. Really, all it's doing is kind of providing a little bit of something extra for being allowed to go in an area that we had identified as being prohibited. I'm not super passionate about this. If the commission felt like that indemnification was strange, as was described, I'm not sure it substantively affects the code. So, and that's really what I heard.
Anybody want to make a comment on that? Anybody want to?
I'm fine for leaving it in. It's protection for the city. If the equipment doesn't pose a hazard, then it should be a non-issue.
I think sentences like that are in just about every type of situation like this, so I don't have a problem with it.
Okay. And the only other thing, so I do want to thank Devendra for providing us with a photo sim. So we asked for what this would look like, what the 28 cubic feet would look like. If you guys want to see an example,
Please.
again, I appreciate that Verizon did this for us. They did not have to do that, so here is what this could look like. So this is on this would be on, obviously, an existing power pole. So this would be a situation where they would either have to put in a replacement pole that would be a taller height, or there would be an extension on top of the existing pole. The small cell antennas would go at the top, and that would be about at 50 feet. And then here's the 28 cubic foot cabinet, right here. So this is kind of what it could look like. And again, this is utilizing an existing power and light pole. If this was a new installation, obviously there'd be less clutter on the pole, but this is likely, I think, what you would see Old Town, Squawk, where we have wooden poles.
So to David's point, why would we put the cabinet in eye view like that instead of on the ground where it could be camouflaged with vegetation?
So, right now, I believe,
I mean, I look at that thing and and I appreciate Verizon doing that, but, and I've been looking on the internet, these things are really ugly when they're actually installed. And if it's on the bottom, it's not so ugly.
so right now what we have is under 4, so I'm in section 100, which is the design section. And if you look at 4, which says pole-mounted equipment shall be located on the least visible side of the pole and as high up on the pole as is feasible. So what our code said was, if you're gonna stick it on the pole, try and stick it up as high as possible to get it above that line of sight that most of us kind of walk around with, unless you have your head down, then it would be on the ground. Second is city wayfinding signs may be required by a designated official to reduce the visual impact of the pole-mounted equipment boxes. So then if you read ground equipment, so number 1, it is the city's preference to not have above ground equipment in the right of way. So we kind of, if it's on the ground, there's a section on screening. We actually would love it to be in a vault, because then you just have a lid. But right now the code would allow it to be pole mounted.
I think these are decisions that the community needs to participate in and contribute to. Because they're gonna have to look at these things. So I can say, I think it's better on the ground, and other people may say they think it's fine being up in the air or down in the ground in a vault, but I think if we need public comment on these initiatives, and the public needs to be pulled in because these are going to be very impactful to the community.
So what do you propose? We've had, this is the second community, or second public meeting. We've had 2 public comments in the last 2 meetings.
I think, well, if you ask the community, they have no idea we're talking about these things. So I think the city should open this up for public, advertise it to the public and say we're having these conversations, show a model of what they may actually be in for. If we don't do it, I think you're gonna have a lot of outcry and a lot of very angry people, because these things are very insightfully ugly. And I mean that in a very nice way. But, I mean, and no offense, I want 5G here, but we have, this isn't just a small utility box, like a cable box or a telephone box in front of someone's house. These things are ginormous, and they're visually impactful, and they're very negative looking. And I've done a lot of research on this, and I've looked at what other communities are having to deal with. And here I pulled an article written in November 21st, 2018, where Bakersfield is having an emergency hearing, community hearing, because their requirements were too light, and they've got junk on towers that are really, really bad looking. And I sent you a picture of that. Do you have ability
Today?
to pull it up?
Yeah, it's in the R drive in the traditional folder. Do you want me to get it for you?
In the R drive where?
Under city council presentations? Way up at the top. It's under clerks.
And so we're talking about real world
That one? No, down?
situations, and I see what has been deployed,
No.
and it's not good. And
So Ron, you can make a recommendation that all new facilities go through a level 3 process, and you can see if you have a second to that motion.
Well, I'm not saying that type of approval for this. All I'm saying is the community needs to help determine whether or not they want boxes on the ground, boxes in the middle of the air, or boxes in a vault.
I understand what you're saying. And the way to get that is because we've all, I think, shared an opinion that every location's different, right? And so there's not going to be one answer that's going to work for everywhere. And so if you believe that each application should have a public review process to decide whether the equipment is pole mounted or ground mounted, you can make that recommendation and see if you have support on the commission for that motion. That's not a recommendation that the administration is supporting.
Well, you're already making a recommendation that the equipment be mid-mounted somewhere on the pole.
That's our existing code, right? So that already went through a process, got adopted. So that part's not changing. So what you're saying is the expansion of the volume of the box has led you to a position where you now want to re-examine the code and the section about pole-mounted equipment.
It's not the volume, it's where it's located that concerns me.
So where it's located was,
Go back to the pictures here.
okay?
So if you look on the far right there,
This one?
right.
Okay.
So that is two utility companies sharing the same pole. And if you look at that, I don't want that in my community. And that's basically what your code is saying we would be in for. Now, if you go to the left, that is a volt mounted equipment, and at the top of that is the antenna. And to me, that's acceptable. Right? So I think before we actually go forward with this and we allow the deployment, the public needs to see what they're in for. Or I can tell you, a lot of people in downtown or in Old Town are not going to want what's on the right. And that's what our recommendation is right now, based on what you've said is in the code.
Well, if you look at that, it says without collaborative city input on the right. I think we're getting collaborative city input by having the codes written the way they are.
I think it needs to go to the public. I'm an advocate for the public.
So if we have a maximum of 28 cubic feet, is that per provider or per pole?
Per
That's,
provider.
Cabinet.
so right now it's going to be per pole because what they've said is they will not co-locate. So AT&T and T-Mobile, or AT&T and Verizon, or the other two would not be on the same pole. So you wouldn't have two boxes on the same pole.
But in theory, we would be on almost every pole in downtown. because they can't be on the same pole. So you would have those boxes on every pole in downtown.
Yes.
That's, I think that's, we need to have the public involved in this. Before we say, we're going to put this in code and say, you know, the city's preference is to have a
So
mid-box.
it's already in code. Again, if you don't think this issue that you're having is based on the volumetric change, which is the only thing that's changing, the code is the code. And if you're recommending a change to the code because you don't like what was adopted by the council already, you can make a recommendation and see if you have 3 commission members or at least one that will second that recommendation. We'll see where it goes.
Okay,
But you're being clear. I understand where you want to go. You need to get one of your 3 peers to support that as well if we're going to potentially unpack that any further.
okay. Can I get a feeling, what are your thoughts, discussions?
What's the clear motion or the request that you're thinking of?
To reopen the conversation about the code of mid-boxes, the city's preference of having a box mid-pole as opposed to in the ground without public support.
I think the only thing that's changed from the public support is just that, like Keith was saying, the actual volume of the cabinet.
But to go back and actually, yeah, the motion would be to go in and actually reevaluate the code that has already been approved.
Because of the volume.
Unpack it because of this, I don't think it was fully addressed, or may not have been fully grasped, of the impact of this. And once it's deployed, we're done. But if it's not deployed yet, now's the time to make a change before we move forward.
Oh, I have a question to one of the gentlemen that spoke. How difficult, how more expensive and more difficult is it to do what my commissioner to the right is, for putting it in a box, putting it on the ground? Is it more expensive, more time consuming, more something? Or in a vault?
Good evening, Greg Bush again. I don't have the exact numbers. It's more of a design preference, the vault versus the mid-mounted utility poles. Right now, we're prohibited from using city poles, and the preference would be to go on utility poles. Ultimately, it comes down to what the industry is allowed to do in the code. So if we're talking expenses, like I said, I can't give numbers, but what the industry ends up using is really what we're allowed to do and what best matches our coverage criteria. So if different carriers have different macro sites, the bigger sites. So one carrier may have a macro site closer to downtown and may not need as many small cells, and another may have a further out one. And it'll depend on the local character. So if we end up using a vault versus a utility pole a block over, it depends on what will fit with community aesthetic and what the local code says.
Thank you. Oh,
Question for Keith. Would it be value added to, I guess, word the code in a way where it's advantageous to use vaults over poles, pole-mounted equipment, and thus increasing the number of encouraged locations for the providers?
So vaults, so right now, if it's ground mounted, we have a preference that says we'd rather have it in a vault than above ground, right? Again, the reason why I think there's not a preference to ground mounted over pole mounted is in some cases, the ground is, where the poles are, is basically used space for something else. And what I would tell you is, for example, you know, if you think about like in the Highlands, you know, around Grand Ridge Plaza, you know, all of that is hardscape, right? And you've got the poles that come up out of the concrete, and it's got concrete around it, and people are walking around there. And, you know, if you've got now a box that's on the ground, and that box, you know, we've got stuff where maybe you can turn it into a bench, maybe it's just a box that's painted some nice color.
I'm
Maybe it's got a
thinking, I'm
bundle
sorry,
wrap.
I'm thinking more towards vault than ground. Getting into the ground where it simply has a lid and it's
Right.
away from view.
So we already say that if it's on the ground, our preference is a vault. That's number one. The problem is you may not be able to vault it because there might be dry utilities under that sidewalk in that location anyway. You might have cable, fiber, gas, electric. So we have a lot of things buried in our right-of-way. And so there's a lot of cases where you wouldn't be able to do that. It's okay to list it as a preference, but it's okay, but we need to understand that there's going to be situations where we can't achieve that preference. But to Ron's point, right now, and just to be clear, does not say we prefer pole mounted. It just says if it's pole mounted, we want it pushed up as far as possible. You know, your photo that's the horrible photo from Oakland, I mean, it looks like it's just barely above like head level, and maybe that's as high up as they could put it, given the pole size in that location, you know. But to Dave's point, so it's. I mean, we have no examples, right? This is, you know, if we had like 5 or 6 out there and we could sit there and debate, you know, how did this turn out? That'd be great, right? Right now we got 0 examples. You know, Dave's concern is we push the box up as high as possible. Well, maybe that's on axis with a view of Cougar Mountain or Mount Rainier. Okay, well, yeah, that'd be bad. And in that case, I'd want it as low as possible if it's going to be pole mounted. So this is the hard thing: is I don't think it's homogeneous. You know, we don't have any examples to point to in town to see how did this code work in its existing form. And so am I hesitant to do a bunch of tinkering to pieces? Given that it's less than a year old, yes. I don't know that it is better to put it on the ground. If you knew that putting it on the ground would be in a vault, that's great. Then all the equipment's out of sight. My concern is we push it on the ground and then you can't get it in a vault, and now you got a big box on the ground. Okay. Where kids get tripped on. I don't know. So I'm just saying, I don't think there's a necessarily a clean right answer.
So a question for you, Keith, is when they're going through this permit application, you or the person that's walking them through that, you guys look at each individual pole and you say, okay, this one blocks a right-of-way of Mount Rainier, or this one is, you know, can't go under vault. So someone's there, you guys are making these decisions together. It's not Verizon dictating where the cabinet's going on each individual pole.
So the one thing I was waiting for Greg to say, and he didn't, I'm gonna just make sure, because is there a technical reason that the box needs to be a certain distance from the antenna?
Performance is, would you like me to come up?
Yes.
So the closer the box is to the antenna, the better the performance is, but vault mounted doesn't get in the way of proper functionality. The only real limitation is that the antenna can't go underground. And undergrounding the equipment is bad in general because then we have to assume it's waterproof and extra maintenance. So it's really, really, really hard. And in fact, I don't think of any market I know of we've successfully undergrounded equipment, so it'd have to be ground mounted. But there's no reason to not put the equipment on the ground in a vault. I mean, technically, yeah, we could do that.
So I live in the Highlands and I have a small yard, and half of my front yard is taken up by 2 big utility boxes, and I hate it. I would much rather have it on a pole than in my yard, or in front of my house, or
It's on the ground, you're gonna see it every day. I mean, the reason why we drafted the code the way we did was, again, if you're not looking up to a vista point, having it, we talked about 50-foot poles, and if the existing utility lines, and we had some data last time, and it seemed like, most of those were somewhere around 22 to 30 feet, if it was an existing power pole. So right now, potentially you could put that box at 15 feet up in the air. Most people, I hate to say, probably wouldn't see it, or they wouldn't notice it. It's part of the infrastructure. Everybody has a different design aesthetic. Some people notice everything, and some people, look at things like this, and that's just part of their normal infrastructure. So, it's your guys's. We're looking for a recommendation from you guys. And at the end of the day, there's at least two pieces that you guys are kind of struggling with. One is the deviation language about the related information and whether you guys want to make a change to that. And the other is, do you want to open up the permitting process to a more public dialogue?
See, I'm okay without having I think, I can only speak for myself, but even to Ron's other point is, I have no problem trusting the city staff to make the best decisions on behalf of the city. My only concern is when they are placing those cabinets on poles, is their city staff making those decisions along with the providers? Because I know you guys will be sitting there, obviously, what's going, okay, this would be better for this neighborhood, so that part makes me feel just fine. Just want to make sure that Verizon and AT&T aren't the ones placing their cabinets.
So I think what we heard was there's some technical reason why the box wants to be close to the antenna, but we also heard that it could be in a vault and still work. So I think what that views is a piece that we can work with the providers on to try and, again, minimize the visual impact of the infrastructure that's going to come.
So my thoughts are the future's here, and even though I don't want anything to ruin my view, I know that people will want the added bandwidth, the added speed, the added whatever it comes with it. They're going to want it, and they're going to need it, and they're going to say, if I have to put a box on my pole to get what I need on my computer or my television, I'm going to do it. That's fine with me. And I would hope that in the process of the future of designing these boxes, that they eventually get smaller, more nicer. And so I don't have any problems right now with leaving the language in, and because I know there are going to be situations where things are going to develop, and I don't think it should list every single thing, and if you have 200 things down there, there's going to be 201, and you're going to say, well, it's not on the list. And I don't have a problem with boxes on the poles.
I'm kind of with Joan and Keith in the sense that I don't necessarily think having a public discourse is going to help, because these cabinets, these poles, they're going on, and because they can't be co-located together, they're going to be on almost every pole, and as long as the city's obviously looking out in the city's best interest, it's going to be what it's going to be. And I don't know if opening it up to public discourse is going to be helpful at this point.
Well, I think part of the opening up to the public is also get public buy-in. So if the public decides they want a mid-pole box, and they voice their opinion and say, this is what we want, I mean, the technology's coming, so we have three options, right? So what option do we want as an average installation? And if they have the buy-in, then they would feel like they're part of the discussion, so when they do come in, it's not shock and awe like there's a blue Atlas sitting on Gilman.
So just to remind the commission of a couple nuances. So on an existing pole, the cabinet has to be on the outside. It's wooden, right? It's not hollow, last I checked. The reason why we showed our typical pole in our code the way we did, so this particular pole, and something tells me I passed it. Sorry about that. Where I am, 110, yep. So this particular pole, the equipment's in the base. So this is a new pole. So if you're putting in a new metal pole, there's the ability, and back to the comment we got from T-Mobile, they have their own kind of internal equipment design, which was one of the requests to specifically add that it's allowed, but it would be allowed based on what we've got here. So the idea is, if it's a new pole, you can hide a lot of the stuff, the cabling and the equipment in the pole design itself. The problem is, and we know we have these, the problem is when you're retrofitting a wooden pole, you can't put it inside, so it either goes on the pole or on the ground. I think I would say, for Joan's reasons, I would agree. In some situations, the ground's actually worse. You know, you've already got this big canister that sits up here that PSE put in, right? And it's kind of masked a little bit by photo simulation. But, you know, this pole already has a lot of stuff on it. And it doesn't mean that it's not relevant, that we're potentially putting more stuff on it, but at some point it's a pole with a bunch of equipment on it. So I hear what you're saying, Ron. I don't necessarily disagree. I don't know that I agree, though, with where you're wanting to take it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go with my commissioners. So my commissioners are saying no, so I'm going to go with them. But I think I appreciate having the healthy conversation about it. I have reservations that the public's going to, there's going to be a big public outcry for this. But, at any rate, I guess we'll just pass.
So the hard thing is it's demand-based infrastructure, right? I mean, they won't put it up unless there is demand from the community. And we heard that last time from the providers is, you know, at some point, we do want this technology as part of our community. It will become commonplace at some point.
Well, I'm not arguing
where-
that. I'm just the execution of the deployment of how we get there, the visual impact to the community is what I'm debating about, but.
Sure.
Okay. All right, we'll move on.
So what about C1? What do you guys want to do with that?
I'd like to propose we remove other relevant information, but instead of just removing it, I'd like to give the city a chance to go back and maybe add better definition. I agree there's going to be non-technical reasons to move from encouraged to discouraged prohibited, but I want it better defined. I think it opens it up too wide.
Okay. Is there support on the commission for that?
I would support it.
Do we have to have a motion for that?
At some point,
For
you
that
guys.
particular, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'd like to make a motion, section 18.22090C1, the reference to other relevant information be removed in exchange for a better definition.
I would second.
Any other discussion?
You know, my training that I received from city staff told me that code is supposed to be nice and tight, so I agree with fellow commissioners.
Okay, so all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Okay. So my suggestion will be that we will try and work with the providers on alternative language before next week, which is the Council Infrastructure Committee.
I don't think it needs 14 different things. It's just to make it tighter, that's all.
I think we got the intent. Okay?
Thank you.
Do we have to Make a motion on the whole
whole
thing.
thing.
So I need a motion to accept what the city has presented.
I'll make a motion.
Go ahead.
I'll make a motion to accept what the city's presented and send it to council
With the revision made this evening by,
with the revisions made this evening. Thank you, Keith.
A second?
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carried. So I want to thank the carriers that have come and put, I hope that, the city and all of the carriers can work together and with the benefit for both of you. So thank you. So with that,
The treasures.
the next thing, the most exciting thing on our agenda is a discussion on the city treasures. And
Okay.
I'm not sure. Trish, are you going to
I
present?
can start it, but Keith has, unless you want to start it, because you're right there. But I'm happy to.
sure, I've been talking for a while, let's keep going, and feel free
Sure.
to jump in, Trish.
I will.
Hey, Keith,
So,
before we get into the Issaquah treasures, can we put small cell towers as an Issaquah treasure?
Which one? How
if,
many?
if
The one on the ground.
Yeah.
So,
Right, very fun.
one of the things that we try to do is to try and make sure we're all pointed in the same direction before we do a bunch of work. And with treasures, so treasures came up. The treasures list is a little bit antiquated. It was put together in '93, I believe. There are 35 things listed on it. And it lives in the comprehensive plan, in the land use section in Appendix B or 2?
Volume 2, yes.
Volume 2, thank you, Trish, for the right words. So what I think we wanted to do this evening, before we say, hey, here's a new list, or let's put together a new list, there's all sorts of things that we need to talk about as it relates to the treasures. One is, right now, the treasures are an aspirational list of things that kind of equate to the soul of the city, in my mind. That's my description. I don't know that it's anywhere else. And they're not things that we have regulated. So there's no code that says that you can't lose a treasure. I think what we wanted to do was just start a conversation about, is this list important? If we're going to update it, should it be aspirational items? Should it be things that we can regulate and make sure they don't disappear? Should it be a combination of those two? Is this a list that's going to sit in the land use volume 2 till the end of time, or should it go somewhere else? Is this something that should have an annual, amendment process? Could somebody be able to add a treasure next year if they wanted to? Is there a nomination process and an approval process? So there's a lot of things I think to talk about. And before we kind of started marching down a path, I think we wanted to have just a broad conversation about, what are the treasures? What should they be? If we're going to renew a list, how are we going to use that list? What's its purpose? Where does it want to live? How does it get changed? There are not a lot of edges to the treasures list from 1993, and I think if we're going to move it forward, part of this would be to, put a little bit more structure around it, or not.
So I'd kind of like to start with, I don't think the three of my cohorts here have a history of how they came to be and
I can do
why they were on
That's
there.
me.
And so I see somebody in the audience that had her fingers in the creation of all this. So I was wondering if
Oh,
Robin would
that's
like to
me.
give us a little bit of a history of how the treasures came to be.
That's you, Robin.
And while Robin makes her way to the microphone, we invited everybody that we could find emails for that either own a treasure, are affiliated with a treasure, would be interested in the treasure. So that's why you see this great group of folks here, is because they have either something to do with the treasures. That's why they're here. Thank you for coming, by the way.
Well,
Go,
we
Robin.
understood there was a Valentine dinner connected.
Yeah,
with
that's on
coming.
Keith. That's after, yeah.
Thank you, Robin Kelly. When this was created, I worked at the Chamber of Commerce, and so I was a part of the process, not organizing it. The Pomegranate Foundation did the organization of it. But we met at the depot, and they invited the public to come, and it was really an open-ended, I mean, just like the list is, we have this list, it doesn't have teeth. I've heard people refer to it over the years of what the community valued. Just to kind of give it some scope. But we weren't doing anything with it as far as saying you can't change this, and obviously some of the elements have changed. We couldn't change the meadow up off of the Issaquah Falls City Road. You know, it's not a meadow any longer. So I think there needs to be discussion of really what the point is. I think it's been nice to have it, though, to refer to. So that when people said, why is that important, we could say, because the community came together. There were a lot of people that took the time to come down, and there were display boards up. And a lot of the community came and looked and talked and said, what's important to me? What makes this feel like a special community? What makes this be Issaquah? So I know when you look at it, and I shared it with someone in my office who lives in Seattle but works here, just to see how she felt about it reading it. And she said, clouds? They valued clouds? But I clearly remember the discussion, the people saying, I love that Issaquah is in this valley and the foothills around it, and how the mist and the clouds hang and how they're around the mountains, and what that feels like as a citizen walking on the street, and that's what we see. And so they are unusual attributes, if you will. They're not necessarily brick and mortar or a specific thing in every case. Sometimes they are, and sometimes people felt really strongly about the ginkgo tree, that we want that to be there. It's really unique, and we value these things. So it was one of the first times I'd seen our community come together like that and really have that open dialogue about what was important, and that it was family friendly. You know, how do you wrap your arms around that? But it was how it felt to people. And they were trying to say that and have this be a narrative of iconic things, but also if you were here, if you were a part of this community represents this, you know, these feelings. And they like the vistas. And there weren't cell towers then. It'd be interesting to see. I can tell you from those people and those comments, they would absolutely believe that that harmed the vistas. It harmed the feel, it harmed the look, because there was a lot of that emotion connected to the discussions. I mean, they really were talking a lot about it being a warm and fuzzy, and I know that's not necessarily easy to manipulate or enforce or regulate, but it was a lot about the feelings of how they felt living here, the feelings of how they felt walking around the community, the feelings they felt about their neighborhoods and the people that they met and worked with and went to dinner with. And so it is a broad, different, unique list. And when I revisited it also, having been a part of it, it really took me back to how engaged people were at this different time many years ago. But they came together. It was important. They took the time out to come and gather in this focus group of sorts. But that was unusual, and people weren't really doing that. And many people came together and talked and worked through what they really felt was important to try to create this list. And lots of things didn't make the list because they weren't elevated to a level that the majority of the people participating valued them.
And some additional context, Robin, that was great, is when growth management came to all of us and said, your community has to take this many housing units and people in 20 years, that's when we came together and said, how will we know that we're still us in 20 years? What do we still need to have when we grow so much? What's important to us to be able to sort of monitor? Did we lose it? Did we grow the wrong way? And so we all got together and said, what do we like now that we want to have still in 20? And the fact that we've only lost one, we've lost the Meadow to apartment complex, I think we did pretty well.
Do we get Lake Sammamish, or does Sammamish get Lake Sammamish?
Well, it's still there. It's still a treasure. It's a lot of people's treasure.
I'm
but
happy to
yeah.
call it an Issaquah treasure.
Right. And the mist, remember, the mist is our ancestors. That's the part I
Oh.
love about that they're
Yeah.
still there hanging, hanging with us.
They're with
which
us.
I just thought was, wow, that one always just, whenever I see the mist, I think, yeah, we're doing okay. It's still there. So, yeah, so it was a really fun time. It was an amazing community event.
It was, and it really did give us something to say, these are the things that people feel really strongly about. And not that we could have stopped anything, if it had come
Right.
to that. There were no teeth to it, and it was never alluded to that was his point. It was just an opportunity for everyone to say, this is really important to me. This is what I love about living here. This is what I want to see, and this is what I hope we can keep.
So 26 years ago, this is completely aspirational. And that's the kind of the question
Right.
tonight is, do we want to mix aspirational with regulatory? Things like that. But in 93
Right.
it was. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Where do you want us to go with this?
I want you all to have a chat. What do you, as all the things that Keith mentioned, well, there he is.
A chat.
So this is on our work plan for this year, right? To update the treasures. And I think we want to just talk to you guys about that before we spend a bunch of staff hours doing something and bring it to you and you go, what did you do? Because this can take a lot of different forms, right? You could say, you know what, let's go have a public meeting, or let's go have a bunch of town hall meetings and see what the community says. At some point, going through the 35 items, or if there's only 34 now, there'll be a conversation. There were parts of the city that weren't in the city in 1993. Issaquah Highlands didn't exist. It was in the county. Is there anything in Issaquah Highlands that is a treasure that the people who live in the Highlands or in Tallis or in South Cove? I mean, we've annexed a lot of land. Geographically, we've changed our city quite a bit. There was a lot of conversation about Providence Heights, that it should have been a treasure. Well, it wasn't in the city when the treasures list was put together. So there's a whole conversation that wants to happen about things that aren't on the list that should be on the list. And my guess is we have a whole new community of interested folks that would like to participate in that dialogue. But we also have to say, okay, is this list, and you heard from Robin, this list was put together as a kind of, this is what we believe our city is, but it does not have teeth. And, if the community feels like, we shouldn't lose the ginkgo tree, well, is there anything we can do about that? I don't know. But this is part of that conversation of, do we leave it an aspirational list? And is our work task really to update it, make it more relevant for 2019 and beyond? The interesting thing in 93, Trish mentioned growth management. So, growth management kind of works in these 20-year blogs, right? So that, the first 20 years was Issaquah Highlands and Tallis, and, we've done that, and it's, pretty much done. There's still some development that's going to happen in both of those, but we're now on the next 20 years, and the next 20 years is the Valley Floor and Central Issaquah. And, as we look at that 20-year cycle, maybe what's important down on the Valley Floor that we want to try and keep. You know, I'm not trying to, staff is here to just start your guys' thought process in you know, this whole thing. You know, and maybe, and I don't know that we need to conclude, there's a lot of people here that might want to also talk about the treasures list. But part of it might be just, you know, we just start to seed a conversation tonight. Maybe the next meeting we say, okay, now that it's set in for a couple weeks, let's talk about this a little bit more. And, you know, at some point, we're gonna have to do some work, set up some public conversations, figure out, you know, are we going out to neighborhood meetings to talk about it with them? Or are we, you know, doing something on our webpage? Are we doing something on our webpage?
Not yet. Tonight's
Okay.
the first.
So part of this is talking about the work product that makes sense if we're going to update this list. Are we going to leave it all aspirational? Do we want to try and create tiers? T-I-E-R-S, not T-E-A-R-S. So, you know, I think it's an open landscape, and you know, I think what we wanted to do was hear from you guys and any interested community members before we start running down the field, because, you know, it would be nice if this thing moves in a way and we end up with a product that community says, great, now we have an updated treasures list and this is what we're going to use it for. That'll be good.
I would like to make sure to update it, but whatever's on the list stays on the list. I don't want it updated every 2 years or 3 years. New things can be added to it, but if there are treasures, they're always going to be our treasures. So I don't see going in and out and taking things off. So when you end up with a group that everybody feels is really important, they have to stay on there. And there has to be some mechanism in the city to protect them. And if there's no protection, then they could go away, and I don't want that to happen. So those are the two things that concern me. Some of the aspirational things are not things that I would have even thought of, but they're in there. But it would be nice to go through the list and kind of debate, yes, no, whatever. They were on there before, they should stay on there, but that's the list. This is our treasures. We hold them near and dear to our hearts.
So actually, I think this thing's really exciting, and to Joan's point, once they're on here, I think they should stay on here. I think it would be really cool to have a volunteer committee of sorts to discuss what we would want to add to this list and how we would want to protect the items that are on this list. And I would be happy to work on that volunteer committee, and it wouldn't necessarily be up to staff to have to drive this. It would be up to the volunteers to kind of put something together, because your workloads are already really, I'm sure, Keith, you're like floored. This is the last thing you want to do, but I think it'd be really cool to bring the community together, and I think it would be an exciting project. So I would sign up for it.
But I don't want to start from scratch. I want to keep the things that are on there, on there.
Well, yeah, we wouldn't,
Okay.
yeah, this is kind of like the archive, right? So we wouldn't change it, but we might discuss how we would protect it.
Would agree.
That might be the rule. Everything that's ever added to this thing will always have to stay on it.
So we can have a big sign back here that says, these are our treasures.
Right, well, we thought we'd turn it over to the Arts Commission, and they could use it for so many of the work that they do.
Absolutely.
Because that's the other question, is what would you use the list for then also? And, you know, there's a million.
It should be on our website. It should be, this is what makes Issaquah great.
It'd be great on that wall because we don't have a map there anymore.
You know, they may have taken that map down just for this.
Just for the treasures.
Exactly.
Just for the treasures.
So with that in mind, does that give you some direction of where you should go with this, or where we'd like to go with this?
What do they think?
I wholeheartedly agree. When Robin and I were helping the Arts Commission on the new mural on Front Street, we actually referenced the treasures list to bring elements to the mural. And, you know, we had people on that committee that had never heard of it before, so they'd love to learn about it. I think it'd be a great community building event. I think it's well overdue to bring everybody in the community back together and vote to add more things to it, hopefully. I know there's plenty of things out there that I'd love to see on the list, so.
And
Yeah.
having it volunteer-driven would be something that could add to the treasures, because volunteers are part of the treasure. They're not on here.
Right, there you go.
There could be an ad hoc committee just for the treasures list, which I think is fine. To Joan's point, I don't know if it's necessarily something that needs to happen every year. That kind of makes it less treasurable. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
But maybe it's something every 5 years, and I do agree, it should be more than aspirational. If all this hard work's gonna go, and some of these should be protected, I mean, obviously the hatchery, other things like that. I mean,
And
there can be some type of regulatory,
Gotta have the
taking place.
candy, especially tonight.
Bones Candy, absolutely, don't want to ever see that place leave. But obviously, the list should be updated. There's a couple things on here that I saw that I think Robin alluded to Meadows Point, if I got that right.
Yeah, the Meadow's now an apartment complex.
Correct,
So
so
we
that's
lost
no
the Meadow.
longer a treasure. So
Unless
again,
you
I
lived
actually
in
like
the
the.
People that live there might
Unless
disagree.
you're right.
I don't, sure.
So no, I think it's a great idea. I think it should be more than aspirational, and I don't think it's something that we should have to revisit every year, but maybe have an amendment so people could, possibly there's like a one meeting debate. You know, people can bring in a list of treasures. But again, what's one person's treasure is another person's, so I think that would be good.
But then having it every 20 years really does make it a treasure, because you have to really debate it and discuss it, and then it's archived, right? I don't know, if you have it every year, it loses its magic.
Yeah, I agree.
But if you have it every 10 years or 20 years,
Yeah.
then it has more magic to it.
Yeah, more often than every 26 years, for sure. But maybe every 5 to 10 years, we can go back and actually go into amending it. But again, if somebody wants to toss out a treasure, you know, they have an avenue to do it every year, I don't know.
So you put a date on it, say 10 years. On 10 years, then you can take the ones that have been recommended during the 10 years before that. So only on that 10-year date can you make a change to the,
That should get some community involvement.
It'd be fun.
Okay. You guys have given us a lot of thoughts, and I assume you're going to take public comment on this one?
yes, I'm going to.
Okay.
But you were still standing there, so
I'm
I
going
was
to go
gonna
sit
wait.
down then.
So would anybody, this isn't a public hearing, but if anybody would like to come up and please take the microphone and give us your thoughts about, please.
My name is Tyson Garbajuk, one of the owners of Bohm's Candies. This is all new. I've recently discovered in the last few years about the treasures classification, so I'm learning a lot about this tonight, actually. Bohm's is proud to be in existence over 76 years, and I believe since 1956 in Issaquah. The last time we made a major change was 1991 when we expanded our facility, and as I learned from other meetings and the changes with what can be built in Issaquah and where we are in Issaquah, we are slowly discovering, well, how can we remain viable and existent in the business climate that Issaquah has versus when we started, obviously, before even I-90 existed. We are exploring different ways that we can stay there. We're proud to be an Issaquah treasure. As being a private business, we also have to do what's best for us and our employees. And I guess still processing all of this, we don't want to have a lot of restrictions that are put upon us as we try to navigate the next 5 to 10 years of how we can be a viable business, because we have not many obstacles. We have obstacles that we're dealing with. One major one is employment. We have a hard time getting employees, even the high school kids. When I grew up in Issaquah 25 years ago, and I was in high school, we had a lot of high school kids. Now we have a very big population with more high schools and more students, but we can't even staff our storefronts. So that is one obstacle that we're dealing with. Obviously, property taxes and just the other changing things that are in Issaquah, that as much as we like being a treasure, and we're proud to be a treasure, we don't want to have restrictions on what we need to do to exist into the future as a business. So I love the thought of the aspirations, and there are many things that I remember growing up pretty much my whole life in Issaquah and being a resident again the last few years, moving back to Issaquah, that I'm happy about and that I think about, that I remember when I was a kid, from Waterworks Park to even Rocky's Pizza, all these great little things that I remember when Issaquah was truly a small town, when McDonald's came to town in the early 80s. But you know, as far as being a private business, we feel a lot of love from the city and the residents, and we're proud to be here. And but we would like to remain a treasure, but I just don't want there to be restrictions on what we can do, because we want to be part of the city, but also how we can operate and the changes that we may have to make to stay relevant and viable. So, thank you.
Great, thank you.
I think you brought up a good point. I don't think any of us thought about putting more restrictions on it. As long as you make the chocolate, we're fine.
As long as you keep making the best chocolate, we're fine.
Well, that too. That certainly wasn't our intention or my intention to make it any more difficult for anything.
No, it's a great point, though.
Yeah, it is a good point.
Not to have any unintended
I mean,
consequences.
most things you think are so great, and then you don't look at the other side sometimes, that kind of just a little bit off to the other side, that, well, maybe it's good, but you have to look at this too. So thank you.
I missed the microphone, so I came back.
Okay, you come back.
To Tyson's point, I mean, so one of the things, so part of the value of the public conversation is it gets us all thinking about what we want to do at the end of the day. And that's why we don't want to start with what the outcome is right now, because I think we need to have some more conversations before we know where this thing's going to land. You know, for the treasures that are private businesses, you know, I don't think we're talking regulations, but could we talk incentives, right? I mean, if they're important to us, you know, is there a way that we could potentially give them a break on their B&O tax, right? If we want them to stay here as a business in this
You
community.
heard that, right?
You know? So all I'm saying is there's sticks and carrots, right? And, you know, whenever you want something to stay, you can say, okay, I can either get out a big club or I can get out of something to incent them to stay. So that'll be a whole conversation we have down the road as it relates to some of the private properties that are on the treasures list potentially. So again, just kind of keep the edges
Yeah.
open for now.
Does anybody else want to make a comment? David?
David Kapler again. I don't think we've ever used it's something being a treasure as part of an argument that something shouldn't happen to that site or that kind of thing. It has definitely been something to celebrate, and there's more things to celebrate, for sure, that should be on the list, but I don't think it has been, we talked about the tree, the one tree on the list, but I think
No, there's two.
the hills.
No, there's
Yeah.
two trees, the big
Okay,
the
so we
big
got the
tree is
whole,
on
you know,
the-
the hillsides, and that's that whole thing is there, and we have tree ordinances, and we've talked about, you know, tree preservation, important, the canopy in the city and all of that, but we haven't said, you know, tried to say certain trees just have to stay or whatever, or penalized, people penalized what they could do in development because of something on that list. So it's been a non-controversial list and something to celebrate because it hasn't been used punitively.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Sasha Hendricks. I'm the education curator over at the Cougar Mountain Zoo. I've actually lived within the Issaquah area since 1987, so it's been fun to watch everything develop and grow up as I have. So we are very proud to be on the Issaquah treasure list, even though it's now updated to Cougar Mountain Zoo, from what I believe our other name was there from a name. But it is something, you know, being part of this city, we are very proud of. I believe Issaquah is one of 3 cities that actually has a zoo on grounds, per se. So for us being on that list, it is something that's actually in our history, in our information education that we do put out to the public. And we get about 100,000 visitors a year. So it's something when they do come through our gates, they come down into Issaquah as well. So same deal, understanding, you know, restrictions, yeah, probably wouldn't be ideal. We have to go by our own regulations, especially for animal care, welfare, and visitors. But to make it something that's more prosperous, we would definitely be on board for that. So we're very proud, and we like to stand by that.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Awesome zoo, by the way.
Hi, I'm Frank Stillwagner. I'm the Director of Development at Village Theater. I'm here in Rob's stead. He's in Cabo. I feel really, really bad for him, but you know, I guess the snow just got to him. We're extremely proud to be on the Treasures list, and in 1993 we were just a small community theater on Front Street, and that theater that we occupied at that time doesn't exist. We rebuilt it in its likeness 8 years ago. It's still First Stage Theater, but we now have the Francis J. Gaudette Theater, which opened in 1994. We have the Tech Studios on First Avenue Northwest. We just purchased what we call the Anderson House, which is not the historic Anderson House, but the Dan and Portia Anderson family artist residence that we purchased a fourplex on Dogwood and just opened in December. And we are building another facility next to our tech studios. So in 23 years, we have grown from probably operation that was about $150,000 a year to a $14 million a year operating budget. So we're proud to be in Issaquah. We're far more than the community theater that we were. We're the region's largest professional theater. And just to reiterate, that was sort of our concern. We were like, so being a treasurer, restrictions would be something that we would.
No restrictions.
Yeah.
No restrictions.
We don't, B&O tax doesn't, you know, we're nonprofit, so it's a little different. So, you know, we could look at other things, yeah. But thanks for the opportunity, and we're proud, and you know, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. So we hope to be celebrating, you know, 40 more and on our 80th anniversary. And what would that be, 2040 something? So.
Yeah.
So thank you.
9, right?
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So when I first moved to Issaquah a long time ago,
I didn't get his email.
you had the old theater.
Yes.
It was, I thought, that was, to me, was the most awesome. It was just so old. It was so cool.
Well, and you'd,
So
you'd sit there and you'd be like, you knew everybody around you because you were like sitting on their lap.
Yeah, you
You'd
were.
you'd help the guy ahead of you.
Steps were all wood,
Yeah,
and
take their coats off
it was
and-
just, you know, down home. I came from a very small town. I grew up in a very, very small town, and that just kind of set the stage for me. So
No pun intended.
I certainly
Obviously,
think-
the old theater's still in use, correct? I see children in
Right.
there all the time.
Right.
Actually, the original space had to be torn down 8 years ago. Last time we had sort of I guess we reopened it about 8 years ago. 2 years before that, 10 years ago, there was another winter like this, and there was a deep, deep freeze, and all the pipes in the building burst. And it flooded the building, and it wasn't salvageable, so we rebuilt it in its likeness. If you come into the facility now, all the wainscoting in the building is all the original wood from the building that's been remilled. The original neon sign was refurbished and put back up, and the core bowl on the front of the building put back in place. So it lives. It's a better facility now. It's more flexible and serves our youth education programs and our new works programs. And there's a gallery space in there now that talks about the history of the original building from that was built in 1913.
Which is awesome. Now, if you could only bring Hamilton to the big theater, I would be really thrilled.
Well, you know, that's a
They're
rights
working
issue.
on it. Cool, thank you.
So, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I'd reflected on the treasures, so I'd like to come to just my process. And I went to the old theater when it was a movie theater. So way back in the day, but not 1913, not quite that old. But as I looked at the things that were listed on the original list, and I thought about Issaquah today because I'm lucky enough to still live and work here, and I thought, you know, there are so many exciting things, and I think that your comment about not revisiting it too often is really important because it takes time for you to reflect back and value something often. So I think 10 or 20 years is plenty of time to be able to have something instilled in your community. So I started thinking about the new things that we have that maybe would come up the next time we revisited it. So Confluence Park, and the skateboard park, the Issaquah Highlands, because they weren't there and nothing was there, and there might be something that's iconic that we would name there. Public art, we have statues and sculptures throughout town. We have murals on Darigold, the Ale House, the Salmon Hatchery, and the new one that's on the side of Japan Ginger. We have wraps on electrical boxes all through town that are all based on artwork. We have the mosaic mural at the Salmon Hatchery, and we have the Blue Door by City Hall. All public art that wasn't there when people were creating that first list. We have the renovated Shell station and feed store. We have all of the walking trail system now that it's amazing to see our citizens out and about utilizing those constantly. So those were all the new ads that came to me just quickly looking at that list. And I thought how wonderful it is that we really have very few that are gone. And so just the revisions are the Village Theater, having the new theater and the old theater. And naming the Issaquah Alps, naming Cougar Mountain, Tiger Mountain, and Squaw Mountain, because I noticed Cougar Mountain wasn't there, and yet there was a great effort to just preserve some of that land. So, you know, we'd want to reflect that somehow, I think. Lake Sammamish State Park with the all-accessible playground, which is an attribute that's very unique to us. The senior center now, because the person in my office who read it said, I don't know how they're putting the library and Memorial Park together. Why do they have them connected on one line? I said, well, in 1993, that was the library next to it. Pickering Farm and Barn. Okay, so the farm's gone, but we've got the barn still. Cougar Mountain Zoo, because of the name change. And the open meadow was literally the only thing that we had to take off. And I thought, oh my gosh. Here we valued them as citizens, and look at how lucky we've been that they are preserved and they're still a part of what we enjoy. And now we have these new things that we can start identifying and treasure the same way. So thanks.
Thanks, Robin.
Anybody else? No?
No?
So we'll have more discussion on that.
Yes.
And then our upcoming schedule, if you want to say something.
Some very exciting new meetings got added to your schedule. Now that we have a Transportation Advisory Board, you all are on the list for at least 2 of their meetings on the Mobility Master Plan, and those are on your calendar on the last page of your.
Is it on there?
Yes. One is in April and one is in November. But they're not PPC nights. They're different.
Monday nights.
They're Monday nights, and we don't know what room they're going to have yet. But I just wanted them on your schedule So you and AJ can be reunited when he tells you all about the mobility master plan. But other than that, knowing that we have quorum issues, that it's real hard now that we're down another person because Lindsay's gone, we're trying maybe to not meet as often. The next one you have is the 28th, which is 2 weeks. The package should go out soon because we're sending out letters to over 3,000 people in town that are either zoned.
To come to a public
Yes,
hearing.
to come and be with us on the 28th of February. And they are either zoned single-family suburban, or they're within 300 feet of a parcel zoned single-family suburban. And the proposed amendment is to not allow new duplexes in those areas and not allow cluster housing, because those areas are not in the central core. And so putting a little bit of additional density there is inconsistent with the central plan. So we're trying to clean up little pieces like that are inconsistent with our directions in central. And that was something that we were made aware of, is that you could do duplexes now in single-family suburban, and it doesn't make sense to put additional density there. But you'll get to talk about that with 3,000 of our closest friends on the 28th of February. And the website's already up for people when they call us or they want more information, that they can go to the website to see that. But are you all available the 28th, since you're sort of my core between you and Joy and Troy? Okay, good. We're also, I think there's something on the front page of the website that we're taking applications now for new members of boards and commissions. So if you know any folks that are just like you, hardworking, thoughtful, can put the time in, we would love to have them apply. And anyone out there in the world, we would love to have them apply to be on Planning Policy Commission, because we've lost a lot of members recently. So that would be really great. I don't know when the interviews will be. They're usually in April-ish, because then they're appointed and their first meeting would be May. So we're going to be a little shorthanded till May till we get new members. But I know you guys will carry the day and we'll be able to be here on those.
Just so everybody knows that we're shorthanded, not because they got bored or
No, they got
just
promoted.
moved on to the city council, to another.
Right. We're a nice stepping stone for some folks.
It's a good training for city council.
It's super
so
good,
if
right.
anybody has aspiration.
Right. But that's all I have, is just mark your calendars for February 28th for the public hearing on single-family suburban.
Any other thoughts for the good of the order? If not, I'm going to close the meeting at 8:43.
Excellent. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.